Thank you so much for being here. I mean, it's snowing, and I know it's Wednesday, and so I appreciate that you're here. So I'll talk to you about futbol, as we call it in Spanish, or soccer. Um, a little bit about my journey, my personal journey, but also how that, with my academic background, came together for the publication of my first book, which is called Juego Peligroso, or A Dangerous Play, and subtitle Historias de lucha y diversidad en el fútbol femenil mexicano. So, like, stories of fight and diversity in Mexican women's soccer. Before I talk about this, I just want to do my personal land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that as a Mexican residing in Durango and working at FLC, I'm a guest on the ancestral lands of the Nuchu Ute people. I recognize that this land is also connected to the communal and ceremonial spaces of the Jicarilla, Apache, Apache, Pueblos of New Mexico, Hopi, Sinam, Hopi, and Diné Navajo nations. I commit to treating this land, its people, and the surrounding nature with respect, and I will continue to honor the original stewards of this land who maintain a deep connection to it. And if you're my student, you already heard this the first week of class, but I need to recognize the fact that I'm a guest here, and also that I'll be talking about borders and borderlands, and that I recognize that these are arbitrary divisions that were done through colonial powers, and that they disrupted and disregarded a lot of cultural, historical, spiritual connections of indigenous and native people. So that every time that I speak about borders, I acknowledge that we are guests in those lands too. So thank you. And so, speaking of borders, I'm going to go back to the beginning, to the very beginning, which is my beginning, where I was born and raised. So I was born in a city called Reynosa, Tamaulipas, in Mexico. And so it's in northern Mexico. As you can see, it borders with southern Texas, or the Rio Grande Valley. And existing in this part of the border was an amazing experience for me. I know that sometimes we hear this from mainstream and from political discourse of like the border being this like violent, cruel space, but it was really an amazing place to be as a kid. And I was privileged enough to exist on both sides of the border. And a lot of people actually do that. Fronterizo people, people from the border, go back and forth, and this is something that has been happening for years and years, right? So the border is alive. And so for me, I would be from Monday to Friday in the Mexico side, and then on the weekends, we would go to the US, right? And so if you could picture this stereotypical, image of kids playing in the street in Mexico, that was my childhood. And that's probably the only stereotype that I fit in. And so like we would make our goals from rocks, right? And we would play on the street, my neighbors, who were really part of like our extended family, really, and my siblings. And I was telling Christine that I would play barefooted, and it's not because I didn't have shoes, it's just like I love to be barefooted. My mom hated it, because of course, like I would come up like bloody feet and everything, but I loved it, right? And then on the weekends, we would cross to the US and visit my mom's side of the family, my mom's a fifth generation of border person they've lived on both sides of the border. We would go to stores, we would buy like authentic American food, like pizza, go to Walmart, Kmart, all those places. So it was pretty fun until my parents decided that we were going to move to the US. I had no say. I was 13 years old, 12 or 13. And so it was an imposition, right? And I was really mad because my life was amazing, right? So we moved to a place called Peñitas, Texas. So like I'll go back, and so you can see like this is where I was born and I lived, and this is where we moved to. So the move doesn't seem like it was huge, right? But it was huge. My parents wanted us to, so their idea was if we were in the US, you're gonna have more opportunities. And they had this idea of the American dream, right? And they were anticipating the violence that was gonna come to my city due to the drug trafficking. Now, there's a lot that I can say about that topic and about the role that the US and Mexico both play in that scenario. But that's a topic for another presentation or for my narco class which we talk about that. But what I can say is that life was completely different on like a 20-minute drive. This is a place where, according to the census information, more than 90% are Mexican or Mexican American, ethnically Mexican, right? And a lot of the people there speak Spanish or understand Spanish. So in theory, it seems like it wasn't such a big difference, but to me it was, mainly for a reason, the school system. So I moved from Mexico in elementary school, leaving elementary school, then coming to the US in middle school. And I hated it. I hated the school system in the US. I have two anecdotes of my first week of classes in the US. The first thing I remember is when my parents took me to do the whole registration thing, and I was gonna go to the restroom, and so I was walking to a restroom, and this lady just like jumped and like stopped me at the door and said something in English, and I didn't understand. And then she was really kind, and she figured she doesn't speak English, I'm gonna translate, and of course most people can do that in southern Texas, and she told me, this is for teachers and staff only. You can come in today, but try not to come here because this is for teachers, right? And I remember feeling so embarrassed, like, you can't even tell like which restroom you belong to, right? It's like I was trying to police myself after that. And then the other anecdote that I remember, and I think a lot about this now that I'm a professor, was the first day of class. This is late 90s, right? So they would print the schedules, and I was introduced to the school counselor. And this is completely foreign to me. We didn't have those, counselors in Mexico. And so he printed the schedule, gave it to me, and said in Spanish, go look for this room, and that's your first class. A choir class. I don't know why I was in choir. I never wanted to sing, right? And so I remember going. I remember the face of this teacher, his name, everything, right? And I come in, and I remember giving him the schedule like this. And he said something in English, and I didn't get it. He said something again in English, and everybody laughed. And I was just there like all red, right? Like, what's happening? And so he just went like that, and then he got tired, and he told me in Spanish, because he spoke Spanish, like, go sit down. And so I just went to sit down, and I was just like red, humiliated, and that was like my first introduction to the U.S. schools, right? And so, very humiliated. I thought, like, I shouldn't even speak. I don't even know what restroom to go in. It was like a bad experience overall. And I think a lot about, the impact that teachers have. And in a little bit, I'll tell you the other side of like an amazing teacher that I had. But I remember this, and I think about this a lot if in class when somebody laughs and we all laugh. And I want to make sure that the student knows, like, oh, we're laughing about something, but not about you, because I remember that a lot. It's not so good that I remember it so much, but it is. And I have this word because that's how I felt throughout this couple of years, which is tonta, which means dumb, but I really felt like really stupid. I think that's the word that would describe those first couple of years. And then there's another thing that to me was very hard, and it was the aesthetics of the schools. On the right, this is the school that I moved when I went to the US. It's called Nelly Leo Junior School. And this is the school that I went to in Mexico. This is a beautiful school. When I pass by it now, sometimes I think like, wow, I came to that school. That looks amazing. But I hated it when I was a teenager. And I know it's because I was attaching all the sentiments to it, but it was a huge building. A lot of the classrooms didn't have windows. It was like at that time I saw it like a prison cell. Of course, it has nothing to it doesn't compare to it at all, right? But at that time, being 13, I was like, oh, this is horrible, and people wouldn't run around, and there was like 8 to like 1 p.m. and then the school bus, and you would get home like at 4 p.m. because this is Texas, and Texas is like hours of like getting home. And on the other side, that's my school in Mexico, and windows everywhere, kids just running around. Yeah, there was no AC or heating, but like it just felt free, right, and liberating. So I miss that a lot. During PE here, we had a gym, and it was amazing. We could do a lot of things. but we couldn't play soccer, for example. People just didn't play soccer. I know that's changed a lot now, but soccer wasn't a sport that we would play during PE. And here, it was in Mexico, is all we played. We would use like the trash cans in school, and we would make the goals, and it was girls and guys, and everybody playing, right? And I missed that a lot. So, not a great experience the first couple of years. I became really timid, very introvert. I wouldn't want to talk. And I also, aside from all of this, I'm thinking, I don't look like all the girls that come to school. Like my gender expression, like, they were all like wearing makeup already and like doing these different things, and I wasn't, right? And so I thought, maybe there's something wrong with me, right? And so I was thinking of all of these things, and it wasn't great. I hated it. But everything changed when I joined ninth grade, which is, high school, because I joined soccer. And soccer is this one thing that has accompanied me throughout my life and has given me so much joy. Don't try to find me. I see you. And I joined the soccer team, and I found a family. I found a community of young women that most of them were Mexican American. A lot of them had just moved to the U.S., and we were all there because we love soccer, and it was amazing. And at the same time, I was doing great in school, but very timid until I met Miss Garcia. And Miss Garcia, she was an immigrant herself from Cuba, and she taught AP Spanish, AP Literature. And I remember just being in her class and being so challenged because she was hard. It was hard. You have to do like this readings and novels and everything. And it was amazing. Like she made me fall in love with literature. And she took me to these other worlds that I never thought that existed anywhere. And she was also very kind. She was the first adult that I came out to. And at this time, I had come out to my mom, and it was a horrible experience. So home became that place I didn't want to go, and school, ironically, was my safe space. And it was the space where, the first two people I came out to were, as a lesbian, were my teammates, and Miss Garcia was the first adult that told me, there's nothing wrong with you. Like, you're a good person. You're a good daughter. Don't worry about it, right? And so this is the other figure that I think of when I think of teaching and the role of teachers. And somebody that I think a lot about when I'm in the classroom. And so I'm a senior in high school. I had taken a lot of concurrent enrollment classes or dual enrollment classes just because they offer them, and I was like, oh, music, cool, this and that, right? And I had like 27 college credits, but I hadn't applied to college. And so the counselor said, you're top 10% of your class, you should apply for college. And I did. And it was interesting because I didn't find out until later on that people applied to like multiple colleges. I didn't even know there were college tours until I came to Fort Lewis and I saw them walking. I was like, what are they doing? They go to schools to see the colleges. So I didn't know, but I was really happy that I got accepted to our local university. That was the only one that I applied, and I made it. And it is the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, although back then it was University of Texas Pan American. So I make it there. I'm all happy, first gen student. And they asked me, like, you need to declare a major. And I'm thinking, like, I don't even know, like, what do people major on? Like, I had seen a movie where there was this woman lawyer, and I said, I want to do that. But then I didn't know anything, like, how do people become lawyers? Like, law school, I didn't know anything. And I remembered Miss Garcia, and I remember, like, the passion that she had, and I was like, I'm going to do literature and Spanish. And so I declare with a major in Spanish and a minor in English, because literature, right, in every language. And I remember my friends and even other people telling me, like, why would you want to major in Spanish if you already speak Spanish? Like, what's the point? Or other people that would think, like, how are you going to find a job? Like, you have to do business or do something else, right? But I didn't care. I was really happy. The classes were really amazing. And soccer. I joined the soccer team. This is a small, now they have like a big athletic division, but back then they only had like clubs. And so I would play for the college club, we would travel around Texas. That's the only way that the first time I had left the Rio Grande Valley, I went to San Antonio, Houston, all these different places, and I was playing indoor soccer too. That's a picture from when we won a tournament in indoor soccer. And so I'm there, and one of my professors, Dr. Ardalani, said, "Hey, you should do a master's, right?" And, I think I've said this somewhere else, but I was thinking, like, what do people do with masters and in Spanish, right? But I really liked school, and I really liked being in the team, and I said, I'll apply. And I applied, and I was doing work in literature, but I've never really thought about research at this point. Like, what's the point of research or anything? Just literature because I love literature, right? And so by the end of the master's, Dr. Ardalani said to me, there's a new program with the University of Houston, and they have a PhD program in Hispanic studies, and I think you should apply. I was like, that's amazing, because now I know a little bit more. I've seen professors, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of like what Ms. Garcia does, but like with university, and like they can say a lot more things and bad words and things that teachers don't say. And so I'm like, yeah, that would be cool. The only thing was this was in Houston, right? And if you know something about Texas, like Houston is about 6 hours away from the border, which is not a huge distance. We were talking about like 6 hours for students. But in my family, and I guess my culture, and this is a generalization, but my family, it wasn't expected for you to go somewhere else to college, right? So I was hesitant, and then thinking like, Houston is a huge city, like millions of people. So I was a little afraid, but I made it, and I had my parents' support, and so I went to the University of Houston, and that's where I was introduced to research. Like, what's the point of research, and like, why do we do it? And also, that's when I decided that I was going to like do this for a living, like always. I taught my first class in the University of Houston when I was like 24, and I was working for Arte Público Press, which is the largest, the biggest, oldest Latino publishing house. So amazing experiences happening here. But soccer is nowhere in the picture because I didn't have any more time to play, and it did feel like I was missing something. I would watch the games, but no more playing in leagues, no more, that community of people. So it was in my mind a lot. And I remember telling my advisor, can I write my thesis on something to do with soccer? And she said, definitely not. She said, you want a job? You want a job in like a Spanish position? Do something more traditional. And it was traditional, although I wrote about Chicana lesbian writers. But she said to me, whenever you get tenure, you can write about whatever you want. And that stayed on my mind. And so all of that brought me to Fort Lewis College. To be honest, and we were talking about this earlier, I had no idea that Durango existed. Like, the only Durango I knew about was Mexico and the one in Spain. And I came for the interview, and I was, of course, mesmerized by the beauty. Like, southern Texas and northern Tamaulipas is plain. There's nothing, and I was overwhelmed by so much beauty. But I had also I did a Wikipedia search of like Durango, and it's like 16,000 people, and I was I remember they got a hotel room for me in downtown Durango, and like Maine, and I was there was no Spanish, there was no I couldn't see Latinx people, and I was like, I don't think this is gonna be a good fit. And then I did my teaching demo, and it was amazing. I remember it was in Jones, and it felt really good. I saw the classroom. I was a little scared because I figured that at that point there's so much I need to learn about this place and about these students that I don't know. I mean, this school system education in Texas, not a lot of histories. And so I realized I have to do a lot of research. I have to do a lot of learning, right? But I came, and I fell in love with the place because of the reason why we're all here, I can imagine. And one of the things was the encouragement to be creative, not just for students, because you can be creative in many ways, I think, with research. And Christine has amazing events where you can see all these different ideas for research, but also for the faculty. I remember thinking, I want to teach a class about soccer. And when I went to pitch it, and I had other friends in other colleges that were like, oh, they don't let me teach anything. It's just they give me the syllabus of what I have to teach, and that's it. And so I went with my soccer and society syllabus to my chair, and she was like, yeah, go for it. So I created soccer and society, and it was a class in Spanish, and it was great. And I was already thinking about more critical ways that about soccer. And Christine asked me when we were meeting when did I think that I wasn't gonna be a professional player. I always knew because I was good, but I wasn't great. Like I knew that I'm not gonna make a living, but also there was no professional leagues. Like in Mexico, there wasn't a professional league, and in the U.S., we know the leagues has had some hasn't been that stable. And then in order to make it to like college soccer, you would have to be to like one of those huge universities that I wasn't gonna make it. And so I never really thought that I could be a player, but I thought that maybe I could have another role, right? Something amazing happened at this time. I was thinking like I should do something with soccer, and then this happened. La Liga MX Femenil. So Mexico started its first professional women's league in 2017. This was a huge accomplishment for women in Mexico, but it showed a lot of inequalities, gender inequalities in many different ways. But it was amazing. So at this time, I'm thinking, I can't play anymore because I can't even run. And then the altitude, like I'll die if I play. So I'm going to interact with it in a different way. So I have two very good friends from my PhD program, professors now, and the director of housing back then, Edgar. And we started a vodcast, which is a video podcast. And we were talking about social issues related to soccer, racism, and, like discrimination, all these different things. And I was thinking, and I thought, I should write something about it. I should write an article. And when I was doing the brainstorming, I was like, this is a lot more than an article. Like, this is book material. And so then I thought, I'm going to write a book, right? And for somebody that loves literature and books, you're like, yeah, that would be like the ultimate thing, right? And I just spent a couple of years just staring and thinking, I'm going to write a book eventually. And if you're a professor here or you work here, there's so much things to do that research sometimes is not, it's a teaching institution. So, but I think more than not having the time, it was just being afraid of doing it. And so I thought, who's going to want to read something that I write? Who's going to want to buy something about soccer in Spanish? Because I wanted to write in Spanish. I wanted to reach the audience, and Spanish has always been a language spoken for the past hundreds of years in the U.S. Like it was important for me to be in Spanish, but I also knew the market wasn't big, right? So, anyways, I'm thinking, and one day I'm thinking of a student who thinks like, "What am I doing here?" And it was a first gen student, and we were having conversations, and I shared a quote with them, and then I thought, this quote is applying not just to students, but also to me. And my spouse made it into I call it a screensaver. She says it's a wallpaper, but this is the screensaver wallpaper that I've had for the last 4 years. And it says, we have this myth that scholarly success is all about brilliance and creativity, but in fact, 90% of it is getting it done, same as any other job. I was like, okay, I am creative. I have the idea. I know what I want to write. I just need to do it. And so I spent a lot of time during the weekend. It became like a second job. I started reading, right? I knew that there was going to be something written already. And there was histories about Latin American women playing soccer. And so I read that, and then I was thinking, what can I add? What does my background and my experiences can add to this? So I started reading more, about LGBTQI movements in Mexico, census data, things about gender violence, feminicides in Mexico. Feminicides is the word that Latin American feminists have given to the killing of women just because they're women. And so thinking about all of these things and how would they apply to soccer, because there were so many different things. I started watching. I already watched a lot of the games, but watching with a very critical eye. Thanks to Fort Lewis, who they support research, I was able to go to Monterrey and Mexico City and be around, the people that were watching this, the women that were making like all these changes to the game. That's why I met Stephanie and Bianca Sierra, who are probably, the first athletes in Mexico to ever come out as queer, a part of the LGBTQI plus community. They're married, they have twins. They're part of my book in a big way. And so there's my spouse and I just, because it was amazing to be able to talk to them, tell them I'm writing this book and you're part of it. And they were like, what? And it was amazing, right? I interviewed coaches. I interviewed the parents of players, and through different means like in person, Google Forms, Zoom, different ways. And then I did the writing, which was the hardest part probably. Although writing it's a very individual thing, as you know, it was also very a collective thing for me, because I had so many friends that were interested, and it was like this community of PhD buddies and now professors that were thinking about these issues too, and that were kind enough to like read my stuff and give me their opinion and editing. And my spouse did so much editing, and so now so all of that came into this book. And so like in the book, what I talk about is, first I want the history, making sure that all of these stories that women have been telling about their experiences with soccer are in writing, right? That they're not, forgotten. And in the last decade, a lot of those stories have resurfaced. Like the fact that in 1970 there was an official World Cup, Women's World Cup in Italy, and that Mexico played there. And they were so popular that in 1971, they hosted this second unofficial World Cup. And I say unofficial because FIFA hasn't approved, and we can talk about FIFA for another hour. But these women were popular in Mexico, and they were in the newspapers. There was like 100,000 people went to see them play the final game in one of the most important stadiums in the world. Then the lack of support, and they just didn't have any resources, and so it just kind of disappeared. It didn't mean that there was no women playing soccer, but like the organized, right? And no support from the league, the men's league, no support from FIFA. And so I keep going and talking about this, and then seeing what the professional league has accomplished now. Records of streamings, of viewing in television, of stadiums that have been 60,000 people watching, and all of the things that are still that are still lacking, like a lot of resources and inequalities and all these different things. So there's a lot to do still, but it's a huge accomplishment. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, and it's my second chapter, is the violence. Like I mentioned feminicides, and in Mexico, statistics show that 10 women die a day because of feminicides, right? This is just like they die because intimate partners kill them, or because of power, hierarchy, all of these things. And although feminicides are the culmination of this violence, there's so many violent things that women face. And soccer players and journalists that cover soccer are not exempt from this. And so I wanted to highlight what they've been experiencing, like a lot of online harassment. Sexism for sure, but a lot of like harassment in person too, like a lot of like dangerous things, and not only like what they've experienced, but how are they protesting it? How are they like responding to this? Because there's this solidarity, right, sorority of like being there for each other, of putting it in the news, of writing about it, of going to the authorities. And so there's a lot of resistance happening with that. And so it was important that I made sure that it was like in writing too, right? A lot of journalists get a lot of threats, and journalism in Mexico is one of the most dangerous professions because of many reasons. And we might think that sports journalists are not, like experiencing violence, but they do a lot. And so like it was important for me to highlight it. One of my favorite chapters is about sexuality. because I could relate a lot of my experiences to it. Um, I don't talk a lot about men's soccer, but this is a chapter where I do, because I wanted to show, like, we all know, if you follow soccer, you know that men's soccer is very homophobic. There is homophobic from like the institutions, just the fact that the two last World Cups were played in places that have no security or warranties for LGBTQI people, to the fact of like players normalizing jokes, homophobic jokes, from like fans chanting homophobic songs. But it is so different in the women's game. And in Mexico, I go into like the movements, the lesbian and gay movements in Mexico historically, but there's no such thing as like famous actresses coming out, or like singers. There's no really representation. I mean, I can count how many like famous people have come out. And so soccer players are just like, they're the ones that are giving visibility to the queer community in Mexico. And they're not just through like social media, because they post a lot, and relationship with other women, but in writing. There's like this theory of like, lesbians being, like their stories are out of like the histories of Mexico, and for many different reasons. And so it's important that we write those histories, right, and we preserve them. And there's like this player, Janely Farias, who's writing for The Advocate, and writing about like how soccer doesn't have to be a bastion for homophobia, which is literally the title of her article. And they're doing a lot of the activism. And so that was my third chapter. And then my fourth chapter, of course, had to do with something I had experienced too, which was about borders and language. And so a lot of the players that play for the Mexican League and in the Mexican national team are born or were born in the US, because of all these things that we know with colonization and everything, right? Immigration and borders. But a lot of them decide to play in Mexico and not the US. And so I wanted to see all of these different issues that come with that. Because some people in Mexico think, well, they come with all these resources because they go to US universities, and so they have a lot more privilege than the Mexican-born players. In a sense, that is true, but I also wanted to talk about all the difficulties that they face in the US, because in order to make it to, I don't know, a university in California or somewhere, you have to go to like camps, you have to pay thousands of dollars to make it to those schools. And the few that have made it, because there's some that make it through scholarships, through like, these schools, and then professionally, they're not selected for the US national team. Like, I can count with my hand how many Mexican American players have been in the national team. So yeah, they have this privilege of, their gyms may be even better than some professional gyms like in college than in Mexico, but it's not all like roses. And like, we know that even like in big athletic departments, most of the resources might go to the men teams and not the women's team. So, okay, they're in Mexico now, and a lot of them have strong connections with Mexico. A lot of them might not. Some of them don't speak Spanish. And so you see them on the field speaking English to each other, representing Mexico. And so all of these things, right, what I talk about is the complications, or like this complex space that we call like that Gloria Anzaldúa calls the open wound, right? Which is, they're not Mexican enough, they're not American enough, they live in this wound that keeps bleeding, which is the borderlands, right? And so, and talking about advocating for Mexican-born players, that, they should get more resources. It's not about they have more, but we should all have the same, or, we should all be having the same. And the last thing that I talk about in the book is this term that I coined, which is food love, feminil. And I was talking to my spouse when we thought about this, and of course it's like food, futbol, and love, but not love in the romantic sense. To me, and I had just read Bell Hook's book about love, and this way that she describes this emotion and this power to transform communities and individuals. And that's how I envision this. Like, what women that are around soccer, because it's not just players, are doing in Mexico is what Bell Hooks describes in her book. It's like this commitment to something that you know it's gonna take. It's a challenge. It's gonna be hard, but you have to stand up and you have to do it because you love it, not in the romantic sense, but because you're passionate about it too in many different ways. So the last thing I'll tell you is that, okay, I have the book in my hands. It's amazing. I'm thinking about Sandra Cisneros. I used to work in an archive in Houston, and I saw, this was not part of my presentation, but I read Sandra Cisneros, who published The House of Mango Street, when she got her first, like, the book in her hands, and that always stayed with me, because she's like, I'm an author. She was telling her editor who was my boss. And I felt that. I thought of Sandra Cisneros, like, I'm an author. I made it. It's in print, right? And then I was like, and now? Who reads this? And then I saw the price at $40. I didn't bring it, but it's like this size. So many years and it's this size. And I was like, 800 pesos, because it's like in the publishing house it's like $40, but then in Amazon it's already like 800 pesos, which is a lot of money. So I'm thinking, speaking to my spouse, and I'm like, and then reading is a privilege, as we know, like people have to have time and space and like buy the book. And so I told her, like, let's do something different. And she said, yeah. So we created this website, and we call it Food Love Femenil. And so what we do here is, like, we have a podcast. We just finished the first season. We're going to start the second one, where we talk about these same issues from our perspectives, right? We have created we're mapping things that we think are important. It's a different way of interacting with, like, data and things like that. We is extent. Like, she created games like bingo with, like, Mexican players, so people can know who they are, their names. Guess who, like the Guess Who, like, we just remove the things, and so she created this, like, you can just print them and put their faces, right? Word crosses, puzzles, a lot of things. And then we write recommendations, like, if you are a fan of soccer the way that we envision soccer, you might like this article, this movie, these songs, whatever, right? And because in my Spanish class and in my gender class, I have activities related to soccer, I link them here. Like, these are activities, if you're teaching Spanish, this is an activity that you can teach about soccer and stuff like that. And it's something that we have fun, we do it, and I hope that it reaches more people than the 800 pesos that it costs to read a book and have the time to read a book. And yeah, that's it. I made it on time. Exactly.